So yeah, Andrew Whale, I'm from Hamilton, Southwest Vic. Thanks for the introduction, David. So tonight we're going to talk about summer drenching. I think the plan is to have questions at the end. If you do want to jump in at any stage, David, if there is a question that's pertinent, I'm more than happy to take it while we're talking about it. But if you want to leave it to the end, that's fine. So look, tonight, I guess the things I'm going to talk you through, worm biology, I really think if you can get a basic understanding of this, not just summer drenching, but all drenching, and a lot of worm management becomes very easy to understand. I think it's probably something we don't learn enough. Timing of the summer drench, why that's really important, and hopefully give you guys the tips for working out when to do that. And for some of you, that will be very, very soon. Hopefully for plenty of other people, it's quite some time away. I've just been up in New South Wales and obviously based in Southwest Vic and do a bit of stuff in South Australia, and we're sort of the season could sort of go two ways really, or three ways, I guess. It could be average, it could really cut out quickly in quite a big area, or if we do get the rain that's sort of forecast, we could end up having a really fantastic spring, which would be great for obviously a lot of livestock producers that have had a reasonably tough sort of 12 to 24 months with low commodity prices. But anyway, yeah, I'll make the point continually tonight, but we cannot plan a date for our summer drench yet. It's going to depend on the season. The decision on whether we need a summer drench, it is something that a decision should be made. It's not something that should always be compulsory, and it should be based on egg counts, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. What drenches to use, how to check that our drenches are working. But as I touched on before, with the polling showing how many of you are doing a fecal egg count reduction test, most of you will have really good information for what drenches are working on your farm. A little bit about grazing management, and then we're not going to forget that the second summer drench is something we also need to know about with our summer drench plans. So worms, why worry about them? I mean, the fact that you guys are here tells me that you're interested in them, so I don't need to bang on about this, but it is the second biggest economic disease in the Australian sheep industry. And, you know, for a long time, it was always put up there as number one. And probably, you know, when neonatal lamb loss became such a big thing and the value of replacement sheep increased, neonatal lamb loss became a more economic disease for us. The current drenches aren't going to last forever, and it's really important that we have management practices that probably keep us financially viable in the short term, but also keep us having sustainable drenches in the long term. I think that's the balance that, advisors and producers, that's the balance we need. We don't want to just run the cheapest drench all the time, but similarly, we can't just use the most expensive drenches every single time, because there hasn't been enough money in farming there hasn't been enough money in farming in recent years. And look, while things have improved, we still need to, the margins aren't that great, to be fair. Here's just some numbers on the cost of worms. Look, this is old data, but it's still probably our most recent data that we have on the cost of worms. And you can see that it's regionally based, the costs, and depending on the business that you're running. And you can see there with the grazing, the people with mixed farming and grazing, cropping and grazing together in the yellow, the cost of worms is so much lower than our higher rainfall areas, and particularly prime lamb production. Most of the costs are in what we lose in production. So growth rates, mortality rates, fertility, wool cut, those things, rather than the cost of the actual treatment of the animals. This is just a list of diseases. You can see that internal parasites are number 2 in terms of costs to us as an industry. And I think it's good to point this out, but the first, the third and the fourth, the first and the third are all about sort of lambing time, perinatal mortalities. So lambs dying short after death, but also ewes dying at lambing time. But take out that lambing event, internal parasites are the biggest. So the host stage, just this will look data heavy, but what we really want to talk about with the summer drench, it is the host stage and the dung stage here. So we think about what happens over summer. We get very few worms surviving a hot, dry summer. And I guess I'm really focusing on hot, dry summer in terms of our summer drench management here tonight. So if we can minimise the amount of worms inside the sheep, it means they're all out on the ground, or the larvae are all out on the ground, and they're exposed to hopefully a hot, dry summer period, which allows us to really minimise the amount of worms that we take into the pasture stage next year in the autumn. And if we think about the dung stage and what happens, we have larvae that sit inside the feces, and they can survive for a long time in hard feces if they don't emerge. So if they don't move on to the L3 infective larvae stage, they can actually stay within the feces. And that's the problem if we allow sheep to run a high egg count and contaminate our pastures with feces that are full of larvae that are just waiting for the autumn break before they emerge and start that life cycle. So I guess I just think this graph is really the key to understanding why we're trying to minimise the worms that go through next year. And it's the 6 months of the year. For some environments, it's 2 months. For some, it's maybe 8 months of the year where we really get a free kick against banging down the worm population if we do it well. And we've got some wonderful examples of this in my area at the moment. I actually had conversations with 3 clients in the last 2 days that haven't drenched a merino ewe, so adults only I'm talking about, not lambs, but they haven't done a drench on their merino ewes since either December or January last year. Now, that's awesome in Hamilton because it's generally a really higher rainfall environment. I guess if we think about what's happened here the last 18 months, we've had a very unseasonally dry period. But what that's allowed people to do is really remove worms or the large number of worms that they might be used to having on farm. So that happens only in a dry year. It becomes a lot easier to do that. And I'll make the point that we go back to June and July, well, maybe not June, but probably late July, August, there were people that were killing weaners that were full of worms. And that really only happens if we fail to minimise the number of worms that we have on the farm through poor drench management over the summer. So I just think it's a really good thing to think about is if we're getting high numbers of worms early in the autumn and we've had a hot, dry summer, we've really probably only got ourselves to blame. Completely don't take that statement seriously if we've had a wet summer, because if you get a wet summer, you're really not getting any chance to kill the worm population. But when we get hot, dry summers, we can really do a job on these worms, provided we get things right, which hopefully we'll talk you through tonight. So I've said all this just now, but worms that survive the summer are what starts our population the following year. So if we don't get things right over that summer management, we end up with a high worm burden next autumn. And once you've got a high worm burden and green grass, there's really no way to change the number of worms on farm apart from lots and lots of drenching and using long-acting products. But what we can do is minimise the need for increased drenching and for longer acting products by using well-timed summer drenches. And we'll talk through this tonight, but the timing, how many get drenched, the monitoring and the selection of the drenches. So the timing of the drench. So it's, I'd love to be a bit more interactive with this and have some questions, but it's all about when the feces begin to harden up. If we wait too long, we ended up with, and I'll show you some photos in a minute, but rock hard feces. We call them score 1 feces, but your little pellets. If we've got pellets that are full of worm eggs, those larvae the eggs that hatch into larvae will survive the summer 50 times better than the eggs that are in feces right now, I would say, on most people's farms, where we're just seeing fairly sloppy feces. So what that means is and let's just all assume you're in my environment where it's quite green. We've probably got grass, 1,500 kilos. It's very fresh. All the feces are soft. Virtually all the larvae that come out of those sheep now will not be alive come February or March. Once we get to November, December, pastures would have hayed off. Sheep will be putting out little pelletized feces, and the larvae or the eggs that hatch into larvae, those larvae will survive up to 6 months, and they'll all just be sitting there ready to infect sheep after the autumn break. They'll turn into an infective larvae after the autumn break. So feces excreted now, not going to survive. Ones that are excreted post-Christmas in a good season and potentially from mid-November onwards in a tighter year or a lower rainfall year will be there in May. So what we want to do is delay our first summer drench for as long as possible without the loss of production, so that we can minimise the reinfection and the likelihood that a second summer drench is going to be required. So how do we get that right? It's egg counting, because we need to know that our sheep aren't losing weight before we get to the first summer drench timing. So if you've got sheep with a really high egg count, and let's not think about Barber's pole, egg counts of 500 right now, those sheep need to be drenched. But if we've got egg counts of 150 and below, we're really comfortable delaying drenching those sheep until we get to the right timing for the first summer drench. So we need to monitor to make sure that sheep aren't losing production. And then it's really all about the timing and waiting for the feces to get to the right fecal score, I guess, for us to do that drench. So if we go too early, we drench and then we just instantly get larval pickup, and then you're back drenching 6 to 8 weeks later, 4 weeks later in weaners in a high stocking rate situation. Go too late, and we've already set up a fair bit of contamination for next year. So just to give you some visuals here, we're too late on the left, we're too early on the right, and for anyone that sort of knows fecal consistency scores, the far left is what we call a score 1, and the middle ones are 1.5 and 2. 2 and 2.5, and over on the right is a 3. So we're aiming for that changing when it's just starting to get a little bit more into that pelletized shape in the 2 middle photographs there. And that coincides with when people are generally cutting hay, and probably when you're probably chasing quantity a little bit more over quality, I would say, because obviously there's a fair bit of variation when people do cut hay. So drenching decision. I think it's really important we consider the farm, and I think this is really important because not all 2 farms are the same, and it's something that people say, I've got an egg count of this, should I drench, should I not? And I just wanted to use 2 different examples. So Hamilton, let's say it's a 100% self-replacing merino sheep farm. There's no cattle, there's no crop. Compared to the Riverina with a mixed farm, which is producing second cross lambs from first cross ewes with a fair bit of cropping. So think about, there's 2 things probably I really want to get you to think about here. One, we've got lots of stubbles that we can put sheep out on where they're not going to get reinfected. And also the worms they put out on those pastures are very unlikely to reinfect sheep next year because they're going back into crop. So we've got super low risk from that perspective. The other thing that's really different in these 2 businesses is our sheep that are high risk of worms next winter are our weaners. If we don't have weaners on a farm because we've only got first cross ewes and we're producing second cross lambs, that high risk group of sheep generally has left the farm at sort of 5-6 months of age, and so they're not a high risk, and they're also not putting out high numbers of worms. So just those 2 key differences there. Add a third one in there, that rainfall in those 2 environments is generally fairly different. So we also have a prolonged worm life cycle generally in Hamilton, which lends itself to having high numbers of worms. So just really important that we think about those things when we're making a decision on how or at what point we're going to drench sheep. So first thing I'm thinking, if we've got egg counts above 300, we're probably going to drench sheep to maintain productivity in the interim before we get to the timing of the first summer drench. But if we've got sheep mature sheep with a count of 150 eggs per gram, and we've got the ability to throw them out on the stubble and they're in good condition, I'm not going to drench those sheep as a first summer drench. I will continue to monitor them, but I won't drench them. That same egg count in our environment around Hamilton, I am giving a first summer drench because I want to minimise how many worms we take through to the following autumn, and I think it's a really good opportunity to hit that on the head. If that egg count was about 80 or 100, I would be less inclined to. Well, I wouldn't drench, and I'd be continuing to monitor those sheep in our environment for the counts to go up before I did actually administer a first summer drench. So, sort of talked about this, but do you need to egg count before a summer drench? I think you do. There will be farms where, you know, you've run your farm for 10, 15, 20 years and you've done a lot of egg counts leading into the summer, and you know that you always need to do a summer drench. If that's the case, I'm probably not going to tell you you need to change. But I do think there is something that has changed a little bit. I think we've got sheep, and this does depend, but there are definitely, you know, genetically we've got sheep that are better at handling worms for two reasons. One, it's genetic, and the other one is we've actually fed them better, and we generally run sheep in better condition than we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. So sheep tend not to be as wormy as they once were. What I think is really dangerous, and you just cannot do, is you can't not egg count and not summer drench. So if you have a date that you've got a summer drench, and that's based around, well, not a date, but you've got a timing of doing it, and it's based around the pastures haying off, and you're going to do that regardless of the egg count, I'm okay with that. I prefer egg counts to make sure we know we need to do it. But if you fail to drench and you haven't done an egg count, I reckon you're setting yourself up for potential massive failures next autumn. So I just think it's absolute no to go down that path. The only other thing there, just to comment on, once we do egg counts and the egg counts are low, is what the timing before we come back again. And I like to sort of see weaners being sort of monitored every 2 to 3 weeks, and probably adult sheep every 4 weeks. Once we do drench them, we can delay both of their. Generally, if it's a well-timed summer drench, we can delay retesting those adults for at least 2 months and probably 6 weeks for weaners. Righto, so that's probably enough on the timing of the summer drench and if we're going to do it or not. Now just a little bit about what products we're going to use, and this is just bringing to your attention that these are the only classes of drenches we have. So we've got the monopantal, or some people know it as Zolvix, the Mectins, which moxidectin, abamectin. I mean, nearly put a line through ivermectin. It really doesn't have any use really now. We have benzimidazoles, which are known as our whites, and levamisole as clears, and those two products on their own are very, very poorly efficacy. And then StarTech, Dequantal, which is a newer product, and then we've got Naphthalifos and Closantal, which in their own right have always been pretty average drenches for our winter worms. Closantal is very useful for Barber's Pole. So I guess if we think about where things are at, we've got the top 5 drenches there are our sort of mainstay drenches that have been effective against winter worms. 2 of them are, I would say they're useful in combination, but on their own right, it's very rare to find a farm where white or clear drenches will work. So we're really left with three actives that are, that have still got some level of potency. So it's just a little bit scary, I think, of how few worms we've got, and I'll show you a bit of data, which is thanks to Virbac. So here we've got, based in winter rainfall regions from the drench resistance test that Virbac have done, the different drenches and now how effective they are. So we've got moxidectin on the far left, we've got Zolvix on the second drench or monopantal, we've got Dequantal and abamectin, which you guys will know as StarTech, and then we've got abamectin on its own in the grey, The clear drench, which is actually probably better than I would expect at 87%, but I think it's probably the lack of it being used that gives it such efficacy. I think if we actually use that product a lot on those farms, it'd fall away quickly, and the white drench at 70%. So really, we've really only got 3 products on farms that we can use and know they're going to work really well. I will put that if we combine the abamectin, the clear, and the white together on a lot of farms, that will be effective, but it's probably very borderline how good it is as a summer drench, and that's where a drench resistance test to know how well it is working is key to know whether that is something that's useful for you. But just wanted to bring your attention just how few chemicals we've got, and let's not forget that the Zolvix Plus, which actually isn't on there, but which is the monopantal and abamectin. When you actually look at that, all of our potent drenches have a mectin in them. So we're very, very reliant on our mectins with 2 other classes of drug being monopantal and Dirkwantel. So just something we've got to make sure we're being smart with our drench choices. And look, this is just to say, know where you are. And you're just guessing if you haven't done some level of testing. And look, property A is brilliant, and property B is in a fair bit of trouble, and would have to be very reliant on those new products that we just spoke about, StarTech and Zolvix. Strategic management. So the other side of summer is that it is hot and dry, and well, it's generally hot and dry, and it gives us a good opportunity to kill worms. But this only works if we use the summer to our advantage. And the larval survival will vary tremendously. And I actually should take you back to the biology, but the larval survival is so much worse when we graze our paddocks out really well. And this is something to think about as we get to summer. Think about the paddocks that you want to put weaners in over next winter, or paddocks you want to lamb down. And look, a lot of people are lambing everywhere now, but if there's paddocks that you know could be high risk or have high risk sheep in them next year, they're the paddocks that we should really be working to consume as much of that dry feed early in summer as possible, so that we can let the sun do its work and bake all these larvae that are trying to survive the summer period. So cattle are fantastic because they're not going to put out sheep worms, and just grazing that paddock. Hay does work. If you're cutting hay, you can actually remove a fair bit of dry matter, and that'll help bake worms. But the best thing you can do is consume these paddocks down to your 700, 1,000 kilos early in the season, and then get off them so that there's no risk of contamination for the rest of the year. It's again, even though stubbles go back into crop, those stubble paddocks are so good at just stopping worm survival because there's nowhere to hide. There's no shade in the normal stubble, particularly after a mob of sheep have been through there. So choosing the right drench, I've probably touched on this a little bit already. Our drench resistance test is the gold standard, and knowing that there's a lack of short-acting drenches, we really need to know where we sit on the drench side of things. I'm a big fan of using our triple combinations when we've got green grass. I think they're very effective, and they're generally cost-effective drenches. And then when we get to the periods where our reinfection is less likely, that's when I'm going to use our gold standard drenches. Moxidectin, Zolvix Plus, and Dirkwantel. I think what we really need to be mindful of is trying to save money by using our white drenches in isolation, or our mectins in isolation, or our clear drenches in isolation, unless we know that they're really effective on our farm. If I take you back to this data here, where we've got our abamectin on its own, our clear on its own, and our white drench, and this is just average farms, there's just no place for using any of those products. They're so bad that you're not going to get a production response. So it's just, I really think there's no place for those single actives anymore, apart from testing how efficacious they are. Sorry. And so really for me, it's either a triple combination drench, or it's one of these sort of newer actives in combination with abamectin. And this highlights why when you use a drench, a single active drench, and you use it repeatedly, resistance is going to develop in sort of, well, at 5%. It's going to start in 3 or 4 years. When we combine them together, we do really increase the time that we get out of those drenches. And that's why there hasn't been any drenches released in isolation anymore. And the science and industry best practice is always use drenches in combination. We don't have the ability to do it because there's no product, and it is cost prohibitive. But in terms of maximising the duration of drenches, putting Zolvix or Monopantal with the Quantal would be the best thing to be doing. In the interim, let's use our triples all the time, and when we're not using triples, we're using one of our gold standard products. So summer, we must use our potent products, and the reason for this is if we use products that are only 90% effective over summer, that means 10% of the worms survive, which means they're putting eggs out all summer, and the autumn break comes. The only worms that have survived are the worms that are in the rock hard poos, and they're all resistant worms. So we very quickly change the drench resistance profile on our farm when we're using those products, particularly over summer. So I don't like using poor drenches at any time, but over summer it is far more dangerous for us to be using those drenches that we do have resistance to. So it is the time to use the higher end products when you get to that summer drench. Righto, so how to determine drench effectiveness. So we do a worm egg count reduction test, which David asked you about at the start. And as I said before, I think it was half of you that have done one in the last 12 months. It might have been 60% in the last 12 months, which is fantastic. It's the gold standard. In my opinion, there's not enough producers doing them. And, to have 50% of an audience or 60% of an audience doing it is phenomenal. I would normally expect it to be less than 10% of an audience that have done a drench resistance test in the last 12 months. And so what I'm promoting a lot is to go and do 10 individual counts on sheep that had an elevated egg count post-drenching. And to just sort of do this as a routine thing, not every time you drench sheep, but every time you go and buy a different active. So let's say you're going to hit your sheep with moxidectin this summer, go and so know they're high, go in 10 to 14 days later, do 10 tests. And if they're all 0, we know the drenches are working well. If we get numerous counts coming back with eggs in the feces, it tells us we're developing resistance. The reason it's really important, and I probably should have got a graphic for you to show you this, but the reason it's really important to do 10 individuals rather than a bulk as a post-drench check is if we just do a bulk, we can't differentiate between one sheep that's been poorly drenched or misdrenched and 9 sheep that have 0 worms inside them, or there being 10 sheep with very small numbers of worms inside them. So you do 10 individuals, you get 1 count that's 400 and 9 that are 0. It's telling me that someone just didn't drench that 1 sheep. Whereas if we do a bulk and it comes back at 40 eggs per gram, I go, I don't know if we've got low level resistance or there's a sheep or 2 that haven't been drenched. When we do the 10 individuals and we get 20s and 40s and 60s, and they're all got some level in them, or a lot of them do, but none of them are really high, we can tell that is clearly drench resistance happening. Obviously, it comes back to what the pre-drenching count was. But I love this because it's so easy to keep an eye on drench effectiveness rather than doing a full-on drench resistance test every 3 or 4 years. This allows us to just keep tabs on how well they're working. And I reckon all your summer drenching, like when you do your first round of summer drenching and you pick a product to use, make sure you test it. And when you're using your triple combinations throughout the winter, make sure you test it 1 or 2 times. I think it's a great thing to do. And look, if you are trying to be a bit of a tight ass and use some of these cheaper products, go and test them and see how they actually are working. It'll be really useful to know. And look, if you're getting all 0s, well, keep doing it. Well, no, still go and use the combination drenches, but at least you can have the confidence that chemicals are working, if they actually are. So the other concept to grasp is refugia. It's a difficult one, but it's the concept that, you know, there's worms in the sheep and there's worms in the environment. Whatever worms are in the sheep are being exposed to the chemical that we're using, or the drench that we're using. But there's always worms out in the environment that aren't being, or haven't been selected against for resistance when we've just drenched our sheep. This is why we may or may not leave some sheep undrenched. And the amount of sheep in refuge, or the amount of worms that are in the environment, in our green pasture time is a lot higher than our dry pasture time. So I guess we have the ability to be a lot more selective for resistance over summer with our drenches, as I touched on before, and that is the key reason why our summer drenching practice is when we should be thinking about leaving some sheep undrenched, particularly when our egg counts aren't super high. So if we've got counts of 200 to 400 and we want to drench the sheep because we want to minimise contamination, but they're in really good condition, that's when I would happily leave 10% of the mob of adult sheep only undrenched. And what that means is that we've got some sheep that they're going to continue to put eggs out on the pasture that haven't been selected against the chemical that we've used. Whereas if we drench everything and the summer does its job and really kills the number of worms or the larvae that are going to make it through to next year, we're going to actually select more for those resistant worms, because there hasn't been many worms survive pre that summer drench. So just something to think about. But the more our summer drench is working in a hot year, is the more incentive there is to leave some sheep undrenched. Now, we'd never leave weaners undrenched because they're high risk, and we'd never leave sheep with a really high egg count undrenched. But when we've got really healthy sheep with a moderate sort of egg count, that's when we can leave that sort of 10% of a mob undrenched. And it, you know, it does work really, really well from a drench resistance perspective. Last thing I think it's the last thing I wanted to cover was the second summer drench. So obviously we've been talking about the first. Do you need to do a second? Do you not? We have no idea until we come back and test. And I think it's really important to get the timing sort of right with this test. If we come in really early after a summer drench, the sheep have had no chance really to pick up worms. So I would say young sheep, and I'm just talking weaners, I would normally check them 4 to 6 weeks post a first summer drench. If you've got your timing right and you've delayed the first summer drench to a period where there won't be much larval pickup immediately afterwards, you should be able to get out to 6 weeks. And if you're in a lower rainfall area, that could be out to 8 to 10 weeks. But I like to check them sort of that 4 to 6 weeks post drenching, and then every 2 to 3 weeks. Again, if you're in a lower rainfall area, you can probably push that out further, and hopefully you guys will have a pretty good awareness of how much you can push that out, but you don't want to let it go too long, because if you go and test your sheep for the second summer drench and you find they've got quite high egg counts, well, all your work's undone. So it's a really important time to get it right, because as I said before, they would have all been doing rock hard little poos all summer, and all those worms that are inside them will actually be sitting there waiting for that autumn break to soften and come out and start the worm life cycle. Mature sheep, generally I'd say 6 to 8 weeks post that first summer drench, and then monthly from a monitoring perspective. But if you're a mixed farmer, decent amount of crop, you might be able to push that out to sort of 6 to 8 weeks after. 6 to 8 weekly monitoring if it's staying hot and dry. Just something to think about. That summer rain. You've got to wait at least sort of 5 weeks before you see an egg count post a summer rain. So don't rush in and test them 2 or 3 weeks after a summer rain and see that they're low and go, oh no, all's good. You've got to get that timing right for the life cycle of the worms before they're actually going to start to lift. But that's a pretty crucial thing, and we're just seeing so much barber's pole in so many areas now that weren't traditional barber's pole areas, and it can really get a run on if if you're not monitoring for that summer rain event. So obviously there's a forecast for a wet summer. If that happens, I think it's it's important that you are monitoring those sheep, and particularly for those that are, you know, wall-to-wall sheep farmers and cattle, it's important you get in early with that. The croppers have got a lot more leniency if you're just out on stubbles. In saying that, a lot of cropping guys have got lucerne. Your lambs are on lucerne; they're the first things to rise, and then you want to lamb on those next winter. It's something you've got to be really mindful of with those young sheep. So the need for a second summer drench, it's going to come down to how well you got the timing right. If you go way too early, your sheep will get contaminated really quickly, and you'll be back giving a summer drench, you know, quite quickly. And it's a real reflection of how well you've sort of managed the contamination over the spring too, which some of that's very much in our control, some of it's not. When we get long seasons, it's really hard not to have relatively high levels of worms come, you know, September, October, when you've had a 6 or 8 month sort of growing season, because the worms tend to just build up and build up. Last thing there, which I've touched on, but the ability to use your non-sheep country or stubbles and cattle to rotate animals and to get them off where there's more contaminated land will have a big bearing on your second summer drench. But key thing is you've just got to come back and test animals to know whether it's a requirement or not. And I think most of the time we can get away. A lot of time we can get away without a second summer drench, but you've just got to test to make sure that is the case.